I study the wild relatives of tomato plants and how they might have evolved. And I have here in this high tunnel setup in South Deerfield at the UMass Research Farm, 143 total plants from 15 different species, including the cultivated tomato and its wild relatives from South America. And so we'll be showing you a few examples of domestication with the tomato group. Here is Solanum pimpinellifolium, the wild ancestor of the tomato. Here you can see a number of its fruits that, compared to the tomatoes you're probably used to, seem quite small. Now, they have the familiar red color and they taste quite a bit like a tomato, but they're nowhere near the size of what you're used to. But as far as we can tell, this is what tomatoes look like in the wild before humans came along and started selecting for traits that we wanted, which bigger size was one of those traits. So leaving this behind, we can fast forward in time through domestication history to see an intermediate plant back here. This is a specimen of what's considered a subspecies of tomatoes now that we think represents the intermediate step between those little tiny wild red ones that were this size, you remember. So you can see they're a little bit bigger. They're still not quite the supermarket tomato size that we're used to. But over thousands of years of humans selecting for larger and larger sized tomatoes, we eventually ended up with something bigger like this that you might find in your grocery store. And so there you have several thousand years of domestication history represented in a few plants. There are about 13 species that grow in the wild in South America, mostly Peru and Ecuador. And most of them don't really look like a tomato. So we have in this tray here representatives of all these different wild species. So here's the cultivated tomato. Here's the intermediate Cerasiforme. This is the wild ancestor, Pimpinellifolium. But then we have these various other ones that are mostly green. This one is quite hairy, not appetizing to me at all. There's a few that are orange, and actually these orange ones are native to the Galapagos Islands, which is a whole interesting story there about how they ended up there. But most of the wild species are green, pretty nondescript, not all that appetizing to us. So you can probably see why humans came along and picked this one as the one they wanted to domesticate. So we can show you one example of what the plant actually looks like. So this one is a species called Solanum pinellii. And right here we have a plant, and if you remember what the leaves and the structure of the cultivated tomato looks like, this is quite different. It's actually quite sticky. And here's a bunch of the fruits. When they ripen, they fall off the plant. So here's one that I found on the ground, and they start to get quite squishy, a little bit darker. But this is when they're ready to eat, and perhaps they're eaten by rodents scurrying along the ground that come by and pick them up after they fall. But anyway, I think I'll give it a taste to let you know how it compares to a cultivated tomato. Not terrible, but not really something I'd want to go out of my way to eat either. Has a little bit of bitterness to it that's not that nice, but mostly it's kind of bland and watery. So anyway, there's probably some animals out there in the wild that like to eat it, but not something that humans wanted to domesticate. So there you have it, one of the wild relatives of tomatoes.